The program I've got coming today, I'm really interested in being a car guy. And I actually saw a write-up, a very favorable write-up on his book in the Wall Street Journal well over a year ago. I really appreciate Neal hanging in there so long in order to get this program together. Um, Probably it's taken longer to get the program done than it actually took him to write this book, but we're very honored to have Neal Bascomb with us today. Neal is a national award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of a number of books, including The Winter Fortress, Hunting Eichmann, The Perfect Mile, Higher, The Nazi Hunters, and Red Mutiny. Neal must not leave that room. He's got to be just typing all the time here with all the books that he's cranked out. So this is a really unique story that Neal has, and I encourage you to really take a serious look at this book if you are all intrigued with World War history and or car things. So Neal, you can take it over.
Wonderful. Thank you, JD, and thank you to the Rotary for having me this afternoon. I'm actually at my in-laws' house in New Jersey right now because my roof and windows on my new house are in back order as well. So I'm residing here at the moment. So I've written, as JD introduced, a range of different books on everything from the hunt for Adolf Eichmann, the eventual capture of him in Argentina, to the sabotage of the German atomic bomb program, to the breaking of the 4-minute mile by Roger Bannister. This sort of wide range, and I think my wife ungenerously says that I choose my topics based on where I want to travel next. But I actually have two questions that I ask myself before I venture into a book. And this story of Faster, I did the same. And I'm going to put up, I have a slideshow for you all, so I'm going to share my screen 1 second. So, as I said, I had two questions I asked myself before I venture into a book. And the first is, do I have something new to say? And this remarkable David and Goliath story of Rene Dreyfus, a French driver, and Lucy Schell, an American heiress, sort of coming together to take on the Germans, really had not been written before, hadn't really been explored. So it was very new territory. Unlike some of my other books, where I had to uncover sort of new information, this was a story that no one had really ever told. So that was actually a very easy one for me. The second one was that I asked myself is, does this story have something important to say? And I actually never, JD said he's a motorsport fan, but I actually never thought that I'd write a story about motorsport. I was not terribly interested in it, hadn't watched much of it. But this story about Europe in the 1930s, right before World War II, encompasses everything from Hitler's rise to power to the dynamic that some people sort of related to walking on quicksand in Europe at that time. You didn't really quite know what was going to happen. And this is really a story in Faster, a story about resistance, of Rene and Lucy sort of coming together, standing up against the Nazis, and piercing their seeming invincibility in the arena of motorsport. Now, did that stop the Germans from launching into World War II? No, but symbols matter. And this story of Rene becoming a divine avenger for the Jewish people is really a remarkable, inspiring story, and one that's been, an absolute pleasure to research and a great one to write as well. I kind of want to start at the end, because what got me into this story was this anecdote that I heard about this car called the Delahaye 145. Now, the Delahaye 145 had been restored and showcased at Pebble Beach, Concours, a few years ago. And there was some press around that, about this story about this car, and how right when Hitler invaded France, the owners of the Delahaye 145 took the car out of Paris, had it hidden. There were actually 4 of these race cars built, had them dismantled and hidden in caves in France. Rene Dreyfus had to escape Europe. And third, Hitler sent his henchmen to the Automobile Club of France, had all the records seized there, taken away, and ultimately destroyed. he wanted no record of what had happened right before the war with this Delahaye car against his Silver Arrow race cars. And so, sort of reconstructing this story of a history that Hitler wanted to erase himself was very fascinating to me. I'll start with Rene. Now, Rene was born in Nice. He had his father was Jewish, his mother was Catholic. From Italy, he sort of wasn't raised. He was raised in both religions, but his real religion, as he said, was cars and driving fast. One journalist called Rene, and you can see it in his eyes here. He had a stare of searing intensity and undying affection that lets you know without a doubt that Rene was put on this earth to drive cars fast. Now, Rene really launched himself onto the scene of racing in 1930 by winning the Monaco Grand Prix, the second ever run Monaco Grand Prix. It was a very new race at that time. He actually won it in a crafty way by putting a spare gas tank in his passenger seat, and so he didn't actually have to pit stop during the race, which gave him a leg up, and he ultimately won it. You could just see how exhausting and exhausted Rene looks here. Driving these cars in the 1930s was no easy gambit. You really had to sort of manhandle them around the course. It was a very dangerous time in motorsport. You would almost have a racer dying every weekend at these races because the speed of these cars had advanced so quickly, and yet there was no safety precautions. So no helmet, no roll bar, no cage, barely even a harness. And so it was a really death-defying sport to be involved in. It is now, but it particularly was the case in 1930. Rene, two things happened to Rene very quickly. The first is he gets in this car crash in 1932 at a Grand Prix in France. Is thrown from the car, as he described it, sort of skidded across the road like a rock. But remarkably, he came out of it relatively unscathed. After a week of the hospital, he was released. But what ultimately happened is he lost his nerve as a driver because of that crash. So initially, he had sort of launched into the Grand Prix, was one of the top drivers. He was driving from everyone from Maserati to Alfa Romeo to Bugatti, and then suddenly has this crash and loses his nerve. The second thing that happens that we all know happens in Europe at this time is the rise of National Socialism, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, Mussolini, Hitler, and Rene largely found himself as considered a Jewish driver because he had probably the most recognizable Jewish surname in Europe at the time, Dreyfus. Found himself banned from the best teams and the best cars. So by 1935, 1936, he's really sort of, probably the best way to describe it is kind of like a horse jockey without a horse. He can't participate in racing. The second sort of key character in the story is Rudy Caracciola. Rudy was German, born into a very wealthy family. He was kind of a rascal of the highest order. He would, as a teenager, he would hijack boats, steal cars, gets in all kinds of trouble. But very much like Rene, and you can find it with all these individuals at this time, driving for them was everything. It was that moment in their lives where everything was very clear to them. Everything sort of stripped away. And, the exhilaration and the love that they had for racing was very clear. Rudy had it. Rene had it. Rudy becomes, by the late 1920s, the early 1930s, really the best driver in Europe at that time. He was called the Rainmaster. He won his first Grand Prix in Germany in 1926. And very much like Rene, he runs into two problems. The first, echoing Rene very much so, is he gets into a crash at Monaco in 1933, but a much more 1932, a much worse crash than Rene. He absolutely crushed his right leg. In surgery, they had to shorten the leg and so he walked forever with a limp. No one thought that he'd ever be able to drive again. He was in recovery for over a year. Second thing that happens to him is he loses his wife, the love of his life, Charlie. While he's recovering, she goes skiing one day and is killed in an avalanche. And Rudy really, at that point in time, much like Renee, finds himself sort of lost in the wilderness, sort of wandering around, not knowing where his life's going to go and what's going to happen. So for Rudy, his salvation comes actually with the rise of Hitler to power in 1933. Because Hitler, right soon after coming to power, actually in the second speech he ever gave as the new Chancellor of Germany, was at the Berlin Motor Show in 1933. And he says four things. I mean, he wants to do four things to build the automobile business and to revitalize Germany. He wants to slash taxes. He wants to align the sort of technology of racing and cars with the aviation. He wants to build a national highway. And fourth, but by no means least, he wants to dominate international motorsport. And he wants to do that, because motorsport at that time is the biggest sport in Europe. It is baseball, football, basketball combined. It's in every newspaper, it's front pages. These racers are the celebrities of the time. And so by winning in motorsport, it can be a great propaganda win for the Germans. And so he pours millions and millions of marks, time, and attention into Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, which is really the predecessor of Audi, to build the fastest cars that have ever been seen on the racetracks in history. And that's what he creates, what's called the Silver Arrows. And you can see them in this illustration here. They were the most technologically advanced. They were about 50% more powerful than other cars. And they absolutely swept the field starting in 1934. I mean, they were just absolutely unbeatable. They were, not only more powerful, but more agile. And they had this whole team behind them, sort of an army of engineers, drivers, and mechanics, sort of putting in this effort to make the Germans and the Silver Arrows the best. And so Rudy Caracciola, pictured here, returns to motorsport, gets into these cars that are adjusted specifically for him and his handicap. And he absolutely crushes everybody. And he's once again sort of top of his game, and he's a hero of the Reich. One of the propaganda would be everything from, I guess my probably favorite line that they had here is swift as greyhounds, tough as leather, and strong as Krupp steel. And that's what they were trying to do with these Silver Arrows and these drivers, was to raise the profile of Germany, which they were very successful in doing. By 1936, no one is really taking them on. And that's where Lucy Schell comes in. Lucy was born actually in Paris. Her father was American from Pennsylvania, had made his fortune in factories there and helping build the New York City subway. Goes to France to sort of enjoy his newfound wealth, meets and marries a French woman, and Lucy comes into the world in the early 1900s. She is, could have very easily lived a sort of life of idle and leisure, but Lucy was an absolute spitfire from day one. She volunteered to be a nurse in World War I. She then enjoyed the sort of movable feast of Paris in the 1920s with the artists and writers, and she was sort of at the center of that with all her wealth. And then she also begins to catch the bug of motor racing through her husband, Laurie. And she becomes one of the early speed queens, one of the early female race drivers, and she was an exceptionally good one. She was not only, as one journalist described her, the more dangerous things got, the bigger the smile was on her face. And she was particularly good in rally driving, long distance races, particularly the Monte Carlo rally, these 2,300-mile, multiple day events where you drive day and night with very little rest on icy roads. Some people called the Monte Carlo rally, the race that someone participates in if they're looking for trouble. And Lucy was definitely that. She was always sort of looking for trouble. She became the top American male or female rally driver in the early 1930s. But by the mid 1930s, at the same time that Renee is sort of lost and Rudy is sort of gaining his feet again with the rise of Hitler, Lucy finds that she's sort of aging out of racing in her mid 30s. She has two young children. And so she decides she's going to sort of put away her racing overalls and launch her own racing team, which no woman had done before. And she decides to do not only a racing team, but she decides to participate in the top of that, which is the Grand Prix. And so she starts her own team, she funds it, and she needs to develop a car. And she's doing all of this because of the Germans, largely. She's doing it because she's watched these Silver Arrows take over the field, all the attention they've gotten, just crushing Bugatti and Maserati and Alfa Romeo and everybody else, and nobody is doing anything. Not the French, not the Americans, British, nobody is taking them on. And so she decides to do that herself. So she goes to this is a picture of her husband, Laurie, actually, and Lucy at the end of the Monte Carlo rally. She goes to this car company called Delahaye, which was, probably the first French company to build a motor car, really. And by the 1930s, was really a truck company. They built postal trucks, they built fire engine trucks, they built, transport trucks. Their cars were not terribly good. One critic called them, their cars were the perfect car to drive in a funeral procession, which isn't very kind. So by the 1930s, they're sort of running into bankruptcy, and Lucy knows the young engineer who just got hired there, Jean-Francois, who's a bit of a genius, and she goes to the Delahaye company and says, you're on the verge of bankruptcy. I will, give you all the money you need, Jean-Francois, but you need to build me a Grand Prix race car from scratch. And what's incredible is they do that. Jean-Francois takes all this money, and it took probably, to put it in sort of percentage terms, about 75% of Lucy's pretty sizable fortune was spent on these race cars and putting together this Grand Prix team to take on the Germans. They build this car, first a sort of sports car, the Delahaye 135. This is a picture of it here, where it won a bunch of time trials and was considered very successful. And then she builds what was to be their Grand Prix car, the Delahaye 145 that I had mentioned in the beginning. And she needs a driver. And as you can see here, in the seat of that car is Renee Dreyfuss. She goes to Renee Dreyfuss, who doesn't have a team, doesn't have a car to drive, and says, you really have no choice. If you want to race, you got to race for me. She knew he was a great talent and knew he was a talent that wasn't being used. And Renee, sort of reluctantly at first, decides to join her team. And he called the Delahaye 145 as he said, the ugliest car he'd ever seen. He said it looked sort of like a praying mantis. The engine was built sort of a derivative of a truck engine. So it was extremely powerful, but also very durable and efficient. And so it turned out to be a very good car. But no one thought that it would have a chance. I mean, a brand new team, brand new car against Mercedes, which had been participating in motorsports since its very beginning, Auto Union, which had dominated with Mercedes thanks to all the money that was being pumped into their coffers, And so no one really gave Delahaye or Renee or Lucy's team a chance in hell. What happens is Renee gets his nerve back thanks to Lucy. She has him participate in everything from the Mille Miglia in Italy to the Monte Carlo Rally to sort of get his nerve back and to get him back in the game, which is successful. This Delahaye then goes on to win in 1937 the sort of fastest car in France competition called the Million Franc Prize. And then in 1938, at the beginning of the new Grand Prix year, right before the war, there's the first race of the season in this place called Pau in France, and it's this huge event, this test of these new cars of the Silver Arrows versus the Delahaye, and really this race at the 1938 Pau, which is the story of Faster chronicles sort of at its climax, is really this David and Goliath story where no one gave Renee and Lucy a chance, and they absolutely swept the Germans at that race. Not to give away too much, but how they did it and their relationship is what this story is really about. And so they end up winning. It's this huge, probably the sort of greatest upset, one of the greatest upsets in motorsport history, and becomes an obsession of Hitler to have this destroyed from history. Any record of this race and this dominance by a French Jewish race car driver and an American beating the Germans at the sport that was most important to them. And there's lots of other sort of side stories in Faster. Everything from how the Germans used all this motorsport technology ultimately to help build their high-powered engines in aviation, to how Germans in motorsport was the sort of basis of creating their sort of blitzkrieg operations in World War II with staffing and bringing together people who know how to operate cars. And it's really, ultimately a story about Renee and Lucy and their friendship that sort of endured through this very trying time. And just what I think is a very delightful story. I'd love to answer any questions that you have, you all may have on motorsport this era, or this story in particular, or anything else.
Neal, that's JD. I actually have two questions. One, do you know where this car currently is?
So there was, as I mentioned, there were four of these cars built. Three are owned by Peter Mullen, who is a sort of very wealthy American car collector, particularly devoted to French cars. And so he actually has a museum out in Oxnard, California, where you can see these cars. You can I've actually driven in one of them out in the sort of orange fields around Oxnard, and it's an exhilarating experience. And then the other is owned on the East Coast by a private collector. And so they all ended up surviving. They took a great deal of restoration to sort of bring them back to their former glory. But they do survive, and they're absolutely, Renee called them the ugliest car I'd ever seen, but it's actually a rather beautiful car.
Mullen's Museum is extraordinary. I've been there multiple times. And what are you working on now? What book are you working on now?
So just in the spirit of doing something different every few years, I'm actually writing about Gandhi Salt March in 1930, which was his first real major nonviolent movement in India, which sort of paved the way for all the nonviolent movements that we know now, whether Martin Luther King Jr. Or the apartheid movements in South Africa. And so it's this story about this remarkable march that Gandhi put together against the British Raj in 1930. And so it sort of tells the story of Gandhi and his philosophy through this very condensed, tight narrative.
When do you expect that to be out?
Well, I have to write it. So the pandemic has slowed research down, particularly in India, where I need to do some traveling. I'm about 75% of the way through the research. It probably should be out in a couple years.
Sid, do we have other questions?
Have other questions in the room, guys?
So from those race cars to today cars, what kind of stand up for the technology from the 1936 for that car to today cars?
Boy, the audio is terrible there.
Oh.
Sid?
So what technology still stand up for those cars from the 19?
I apologize, but I can't hear the question.
So the question is, so the Rene drove a car, the ugliest car, but what is the technology that still stands today in a race car from that car that won in 1938?
What was the tech? I really apologize. It's coming in and out. It's a question about the technology of these cars. I mean, particularly the German cars. You know, the advances that they made in the engines themselves were sort of almost wholly taken by the aviation engineers and brought into the Luftwaffe because of the fuel injection and everything else that they were doing with those cars, which was pretty remarkable. There was really nothing remarkably advanced about the Delahaye car that Jean-Francois built. It was more of a question of just isolating all these various elements of these cars and elements of this particular car and bringing them to a level that really hadn't been seen in a French race car before. The handling of the car was exceptional. And it wasn't as powerful as the Silver Arrows cars, but in particular races, particularly races that were in tight city streets, where the Germans couldn't use all their horsepower, it was able to sort of take them on.
And this car continued to be another model like Mercedes and Audi. Did it come to like Renault, Peugeot, or anything like that?
Perhaps, I'm sorry, I can't hear the question.
Sid, there's so much feedback that you can't understand the words.
So I'm asking if this car, that Delahaye, the 125, become another manufacturing car, like the Mercedes and the Audi still exist. Have that become another manufacturing, like Renault, Peugeot, Citroën, anything like that?
Did Delahaye become another manufacturer? If that was your question, I'm sorry. Delahaye largely survived the war barely, and then was subsumed by another car company in the early 1950s, a car company you never heard of, and then was sort of that company went bankrupt as well. So, actually discovering what Delahaye did and their records was one of the most challenging things, of this story. And I ended up finding it in this, chateau in the middle of France that was owned by this collector. It was pretty challenging to do. The Mercedes and Auto Union, they ended up using that technology, once the war was over. They already had a leg up on the competition, which is why Mercedes in particular was very successful right after the war in racing.
Well, Neal, I think that's probably the last question anyway. Thank you very much for sharing your book with us today, and I really encourage people to take a look at this. That's a very unique story, and he's only really scratched the surface. So thank you, Neal.
Thank you, everybody.